Hey everybody, this is Devin from the Host Broker. I am bringing you a short video today called the 5 Myths About MSP M&A. And I was really inspired to do this presentation because I see a lot of discussion on the MSP subreddit about M&A. And there are some misconceptions out there. So I wanted to talk about those that I commonly see and to kind of clear the air from the perspective of a broker who works with MSPs in particular. So the first misconception that I see is that no one will buy a small MSP. And I think the sentiment of people here is that if you have a very small MSP, it's essentially just a job. You don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the sales and marketing engine, you don't have processes and employees in place. And without those things, you're really not selling a business, you're just kind of selling a job. And therefore, no one wants to buy a small MSP like that. I can tell you firsthand that I've sold many small MSPs, and this sentiment is just not true. We have many buyers interested in small MSPs, but yes, it tends to be at a lower multiple for those, for the reasons that are alluded to. But that's not to say that people aren't interested. You might get closer maybe to like a 2 times, maybe a 3 times, depending on how large the MSP is. But there's still a big pool of buyers who are interested in MSPs like this. For the smallest of MSPs, we might see it structured where the deal is a referral arrangement instead of an acquisition arrangement. So essentially, the customers are handed over to the buyer, and the seller receives X percentage of the revenue for, let's say, a year or 2 years. So it could be structured that way instead, but regardless, there are many buyers who are interested in small MSPs. Myth number two is that no one will buy a solo MSP if the seller is planning to leave. So this really gets at the notion of key man risk. And if the customers are used to contacting the seller for service, calling maybe their personal cell phone, perhaps they're accustomed to doing so after hours, that the seller is just too important to the business, and without them, there is nothing to sell. This is also not a deal breaker, but there is some risk here, and there are ways to help mitigate that risk in terms of the deal structure. So the biggest one would be an earnout, where there are payments paid in the future that are tied to revenue metrics being maintained. So this will help reduce the risk of churn. And a seller in this instance can expect to get less at close and more tied to future payments with an earnout. It's also likely that the seller is going to be more heavily relied upon during the transition to make sure that those customers are handed over to the buyer in a smooth fashion. And the customers get used to dealing with the new buyer instead of the seller. And there needs to be attention paid, in particular, to how support requests are made. So if customers are used to calling the seller on their personal cell phone and getting after hours treatment, things like that, they need to be taught to submit tickets, to understand the process for getting after hours support. So there is, a bit of that aspect that's involved during the transition, but that is something that can be addressed. The next myth is that no one will buy an MSP without client contracts. So essentially, people falsely assume that if the clients are not on contract, that there's essentially nothing to sell. I did a whole webinar on this topic recently with Ann Hall from IT Agree. Go check it out on our YouTube channel. We went in depth on this topic. But the gist is that this is not the case, that there are lots of buyers who are interested in acquiring MSP customers, even if they're not on contract. Um, Not having those contracts does impact the deal terms, but less so the valuation. So, yes, you'll probably get a little bit more money if your MSP does have customer contracts, but the bigger impact is really on how the deal structure is arranged. And without customer contracts, you're going to get less at close. There's going to be more tied to holdbacks, more tied to earnouts, and also just other future payments where there's contingencies associated with them. Um, but in reality, there's not a lot of churn in MSP acquisitions. If the client continues to have good service from the buyer, then they're probably not going to want to leave unless they were already somewhat unhappy with their service. Then they might, at that point, take the opportunity to go find a different MSP to support them. But it's not a large percentage of clients that are expected to churn, even when they don't have contracts. Another thing is just recognizing that the earnout is likely to be sizable. It wouldn't be uncommon for it to be, close to maybe even half of the valuation. So it has a big impact on the payment terms, but there's still a lot of buyers who are interested in MSPs that don't have client contracts. In fact, about 50% of the MSPs we sell don't have client contracts. Myth number four is that no one will buy an MSP with high customer concentration. Um, so, the issue here is that high customer concentration means that there's a lot of risks for the buyer. And if any of those large customers were to churn during the transition period, then it's not going to be a worthwhile deal from the buyer's perspective. But this is not a deal breaker for all buyers. It is for some. Some buyers will just not look at MSPs at all if they have a high degree of customer concentration. But again, this can be a risk that is mitigated with the deal terms. And earnouts and contingencies can be used to, help spread the risk for whether clients are going to churn or not. And that's what we see most often. Myth number five is that no one will buy an MSP with little recurring revenue. And don't get me wrong, more recurring revenue definitely helps. The opportunities that we see that get the most interest from buyers are ones where there is a lot of recurring revenue. It's really what managed services is all about. But having said that, there are lots of buyers who are interested in MSPs that have a lot of project work, time and materials, or block hours. Some of them are only interested in pure play MSPs, so it will be disqualifying, but a lot of buyers are more flexible. And the buyers who are interested here are typically looking at this and saying, hey, there's an upsell opportunity. Maybe we could get this MSP at a bargain because there isn't a lot of recurring revenue, but then we can try to upsell the customers to get them on MSP contracts. For an MSP that doesn't have a lot of recurring revenue, it does impact the valuation. And also it does impact the deal structure. It will be less favorable, less at close, more tied to earnouts and other contingencies as well. But still, there's a large market of buyers that are interested in MSPs like this that don't have a ton of recurring revenue. So thanks so much for listening today. I hope that was valuable. If you have any questions on the presentation or about the M&A process in general for MSPs, please feel free to reach out to us. Our email is info@thehostbroker.com, and I hope to talk to you soon. Thanks.